Panic and adrenaline surged through me as I fought against the raging sea. Each wave was a monstrous force, trying to drag me down into the abyss. Clinging desperately to the shattered mast, a lifeline in the tempest, I glimpsed our ship, the Mariana, succumbing to the wrath of the ocean. Her once proud sails, now tattered and beaten, disappeared beneath the waves, swallowed whole by the relentless sea. Ahead, through the veil of rain and mist, the dark outline of the island emerged. Its cliffs rose like jagged teeth against the backdrop of the stormy sky, threatening and unwelcoming. Yet it was my only chance of survival. With every ounce of strength left in me, I paddled towards it, driven by the primal instinct to live. The current fought me at every stroke, but desperation lent me energy. Finally, the tumultuous sea gave way to the shallower waters of the shore. My hands, numb and bleeding, released the wood as I staggered onto the beach. My knees buckled, and I collapsed onto the wet sand, coughing and gasping for air. The reality of my predicament descended upon me like the cold blanket of fog that enveloped the island. I was alone, utterly alone. Where were my crewmates? Had any of them made it? The thought was quickly stifled by the immediate need for survival. They were gone, and I was here, stranded on this alien shore. I pushed myself up, my body protesting with pain and exhaustion. The wind howled mercilessly, chilling me to the bone. The beach was a desolate stretch of sand and rock, offering no comfort or shelter. I had to move inland, find something, anything to keep me alive. I looked back once more at the sea, hoping to see a sign of my comrades. But there was nothing. Just the churning, angry waters that had claimed them. No time to mourn, I muttered to myself, a mantra against the despair threatening to engulf me. My gaze turned to the dense forest that blanketed the island. It stood there, silent and brooding, shrouded in mist. I didn't know what dangers lurked within, but I had no choice. I needed shelter, food, a weapon, anything to fend off the unknown threats of this grim place. As I ventured towards the tree line, a sense of anxiety grew. The island felt alive, its unseen eyes following my every move. I shook off the feeling, telling myself it was just the shock and exhaustion playing tricks on me. Yet deep down, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was terribly wrong here. This was no ordinary island. It was a place of secrets, of hidden terrors. And I had just set foot into its dark heart. With cautious steps, I ventured into the forest, the canopy of twisted trees swallowing the last remnants of daylight. The forest floor was a tangle of roots and underbrush, making every step a laborious effort. I kept my eyes peeled for any sign of edible plants or fresh water, but my attention was constantly drawn to the unsettling quiet of the woods. It was as if the island held its breath, watching my every move. As the shadows lengthened, an eerie feeling crept over me. The forest seemed to whisper with a voice that was felt rather than heard. My heart raced. I knew I wasn't alone. A rustling in the underbrush sent me spinning around, hand searching for a weapon. But there was nothing, just the sway of the trees in the wind. I stumbled upon a narrow stream, its water dark and murky, but it was a welcome sight. I knelt, cupping the water in my hands. It was brackish and had a metallic taste, but it quenched my thirst. As I drank, I scanned the area for a place to spend the night. A hollow at the base of a large, gnarled tree caught my eye. It was cramped and damp, but it would provide some shelter. No sooner had I settled in than the night came alive with strange sounds. Branches creaked ominously, and distant howls pierced the silence, setting my nerves on edge. I clutched a sharp rock, the only weapon I could find, and tried to stay alert. Sleep was a luxury I couldn't afford. Suddenly, a figure emerged from the darkness, its form barely discernible in the dim light. My heart leapt to my throat. Was it a survivor? Another soul condemned to this wretched place? Or something far worse? The figure moved with a disjointed, unnatural gait, its eyes reflecting the faint moonlight. "Who's there?" I demanded, voice steadier than I felt. The figure halted, tilting its head as if puzzled by my presence. Then, in a guttural, broken voice, it spoke. "Leave! This place! Not safe!" Before I could respond, it vanished into the shadows as swiftly as it had appeared. The warning echoed in my mind, a chilling prophecy of danger. I was torn between heeding the stranger's words and the desperate need to survive. The night grew colder, and the sounds of the forest seemed to grow more menacing. I knew I wouldn't last long without proper shelter and food. As the first light of dawn seeped through the dense canopy, I set out. The encounter from the previous night had shaken me, but I couldn't afford to let fear dictate my actions. I needed to find food and, if possible, a safer place to shelter. The forest gradually gave way to a more open landscape. Tall grasses whispered in the wind, and for a moment, I enjoyed the illusion of normalcy. That was until I stumbled upon something that sent a chill down my spine. Ruins of what appeared to be an old village, overgrown and long abandoned. The sight of it was both haunting and fascinating. Stone cottages, their roofs caved in, stood like silent sentinels of a forgotten time. Nature had reclaimed most of it, but the skeletal structure of the village was still discernible. I tread carefully among the ruins, my eyes scanning for any useful items or signs of recent inhabitants. In one of the cottages, I found a rusty but usable knife, a significant upgrade from the rock I had clung to all night. As I continued my search, I noticed something peculiar. A statue in the village square, partially covered in vines. It depicted a figure, hooded and faceless, an eerie sentinel watching over the abandoned settlement. Its presence was unnerving, and I quickly moved on. My stomach growled, reminding me of my immediate need for food. I foraged through the overgrowth, finding a few edible berries and mushrooms. It wasn't much, but it would keep me going for now. My thoughts, however, were still fixed on the strange figure I had met last night and the ominous warning they had given. In the midst of my exploration, I heard a rustling from one of the ruined houses. I froze, gripping the knife tightly. Was it another survivor? Or something else? I approached cautiously, ready for whatever might come. Peering through a broken window, I saw a figure rummaging through some old furniture. It was a person not much different from myself, ragged and dirty, with a wild look of desperation. Our eyes met, and for a moment we just stared at each other, each assessing the threat level of the other. "Who are you?" I asked, my voice edged with caution. The figure, a man with a scraggly beard and sunken eyes, looked at me warily. "Just a survivor like you," he replied hoarsely. "Been on this damned island for weeks. There's nothing here. Nothing but death and whispers." His words sent a shiver down my spine. "Whispers," I repeated, thinking back to the strange sounds from the night. He nodded, glancing around nervously. "The island, it speaks to you, in the night. Tells you things. Horrible things." His demeanor suggested he was on the brink of madness, driven to the edge by the horrors of the island. I realized then that this place did more than trap the body. It ensnared the mind, twisting reality into something dark and unsettling. Despite my reservations, I sensed an opportunity in this unexpected meeting. If anyone knew how to survive on this forsaken island, it was this man, who had evidently outlasted many others. "Listen," I said, lowering my knife slightly to show I meant no harm. "I'm just trying to survive, like you. Maybe we can help each other." The man eyed me suspiciously, his grip on a battered old crowbar tightening. "Help! On this island, trust is as scarce as food," he said, his voice infused with bitterness. "I understand," I replied cautiously. "But we stand a better chance together than alone, don't you think?" After a long, tense moment, he nodded slowly. "All right, for now, but I'm watching you." As we cautiously navigated our way through the village, the man, who introduced himself as Caleb, shared fragments of his story. He had been part of a research team, he said, come to study the island's unique flora. But their boat was wrecked in a storm, much like mine, and the island became their prison. As night began to fall, Caleb grew visibly tense. He suggested we find a secure place to spend the night. We settled on a relatively intact stone cottage, barricading the door with broken furniture. The night in the village was unlike any darkness I had ever known. It was a living, breathing thing, filled with whispers and distant, mournful cries. Caleb sat with his back to the wall, eyes wide and unblinking, clutching his crowbar like a lifeline. "What are those sounds?" I whispered, my heart racing in my chest. Caleb's voice was a low, scared rumble. "The island. It's haunted. By spirits or demons, I don't know. They come out at night, whispering, crying. They say things that'll drive you mad." I felt a chill creep over me. The air itself seemed full of malice, as if the night wanted to smother us in our sleep. Every creak of the old cottage, every rustle outside made me jump. "You believe in ghosts?" I asked, trying to keep my voice steady. "Not until I came here," he replied, his eyes scanning the darkness outside the window. "This island, it's damned. There's an evil here, deep and ancient, and it doesn't let go of those it claims." I didn't sleep that night. Every shadow seemed to move. Every whisper felt like it was spoken directly into my ear. I thought of the faceless statue in the village square and wondered if it was some kind of warning, a marker of the malevolent presence Caleb spoke of. With the first light of dawn casting a pale glow over the desolate village, Caleb and I agreed that staying put was not an option. We needed to explore the island, to find a way to escape this nightmare. Caleb, though reluctant, admitted he hadn't ventured far from the village since his arrival. Fear, it seemed, had rooted him to this spot. We moved through the dense forest, the undergrowth thick and unforgiving. The trees here grew in twisted, unnatural shapes, as if warped by the island's dark influence. Every so often, Caleb would stop, his eyes scanning the forest as if he expected something to leap out at us. It was during one of these tense pauses that we heard a rustling in the bushes nearby. Instinctively, we both readied our weapons, hearts pounding in our chests. What emerged, however, was not a ghost or demon, but a young woman, dishevelled and clearly in distress. "Please don't hurt me," she stammered, her eyes wide with fear. "I'm just like you, trapped here." Caleb lowered his crowbar, though his suspicion remained. "Who are you? How did you get here?" he demanded. Her name was Ivy, and her story was harrowing. She had been on a small private yacht with her family when a violent storm cast them upon the island. She had been separated from her family during the storm and hadn't found them since. Her tale added another layer to the mystery and horror of this place. We decided to bring Ivy with us. There was safety in numbers, and her knowledge of the island's southern coast could prove useful. As we trekked further, the forest gradually gave way to a rocky terrain, revealing a steep cliff that offered a panoramic, albeit grim, view of the surrounding waters. It was Ivy who first spotted the old lighthouse, perched precariously at the edge of a distant cliff. It was a potential means to signal for rescue. But as Caleb pointed out, getting there would be perilous, and there was no telling if it even worked. We made our way down the cliffside, our progress slow and treacherous. The ground was littered with sharp rocks and loose stones, and more than once we narrowly avoided serious injury. Despite the danger, the promise of possible rescue spurred us on. By late afternoon, we reached the base of the lighthouse. It stood tall and solitary, a silent sentinel facing the relentless sea. The door was locked, but with some effort we managed to force it open. Inside, the lighthouse was musty and abandoned, but remarkably intact. A spiraling staircase wound its way up to the beacon chamber. It was there that we found something that chilled us to the bone. A journal, old and weathered, but its entries were unmistakably recent. The journal belonged to a lighthouse keeper who wrote of strange occurrences on the island, shadows moving in the fog, whispers in the wind, and a deep sense of dread that grew with each passing day. The final entry was a frantic scribble. "It's coming for me. I can hear it in the walls, in the wind. The island is alive." The realization that we were not alone, that something sinister lurked on this island, was paralyzing. Ivy, Caleb and I quickly set to work, examining the mechanism at the top of the lighthouse. Our hearts were buoyed by hope. If we could get the light working, there was a chance we could signal a passing ship. The room was a circular chamber with windows that provided a 360-degree view of the island and the sea. The beacon itself was old and rusted, but surprisingly, the main components seemed intact. It was clear, however, that it hadn't been used in a long time. While Caleb and I inspected the beacon, trying to figure out how to repair and power it, Ivy explored the lower levels of the lighthouse. She returned with a grim expression and a handful of old oil lamps and matches. "There's no electricity, but these might come in handy," she said. As we worked, Caleb shared more about the island's legend, a tale he had heard from the locals before his trip. The island, he explained, was said to be haunted by a malevolent spirit, a vengeful entity that was once betrayed and murdered by the islanders centuries ago. This spirit, according to the legend, had the power to conjure storms and lure sailors to their doom. "The legend says that the spirit can't rest," Caleb continued, his voice barely above a whisper, "and that it traps the souls of those it lures here, feeding off their fear and despair." A chill ran down my spine as I recalled the faceless statue in the village square and the haunting whispers in the night. The pieces of this macabre puzzle were slowly coming together, forming a picture that was as terrifying as it was fascinating. As night began to fall, a sense of urgency overtook us. We needed to get the beacon working before darkness enveloped the island again. Working together, we managed to clean the lens and reflectors. The real challenge was lighting it. With no electricity and a limited supply of oil, we had to be resourceful. Using the old oil lamps, we improvised a way to light the beacon. It wasn't perfect, but it was our best shot. We lit the wick and watched as the flame wavered to life, casting a warm glow in the chamber. To our relief and joy, the light pierced through the twilight. We took turns keeping the flame alive, refilling the oil, and watching for any signs of passing ships. The night in the lighthouse was a tense vigil. Caleb, Ivy, and I took turns keeping watch, both for potential rescuers and for any signs of the malevolent spirit's presence. As the hours crept by, a sense of dread settled over us. The island's malevolent aura was more potent at night, and the strange sounds of the forest seemed to creep closer to our sanctuary. Ivy, who had been relatively composed until now, began to show signs of strain. Her eyes darted nervously to the windows, jumping at every sound. It was during my shift at the watch when the first real encounter occurred. The wind had picked up, howling around the lighthouse like a wailing spectre. I peered out into the darkness, trying to discern any movement in the shadows. That's when I saw it. A figure, shrouded in mist, moving towards the lighthouse with an unnatural, gliding motion. I alerted Caleb and Ivy immediately. We watched in horror as the figure drew closer, its features obscured, but its intent unmistakably malevolent. The temperature in the room dropped, our breaths turning to mist in front of us. "It's here," Caleb whispered, his voice imbued with fear. "The spirit of the island." The figure stopped just at the edge of the beacon's light, as if unable to enter. It raised its arms, and the wind howled louder, the lighthouse shuddering under the force. We could hear the faint, indistinct whispers like voices carried on the wind, forming words we couldn't quite understand. Ivy clutched my arm, her face pale. "What does it want?" She breathed. "Us," Caleb said grimly. It wants to keep us here, forever trapped on this damned island." We stood our ground, not daring to move closer to the windows. The spirit lingered for what felt like an eternity. And then, as suddenly as it had appeared, it dissipated into the mist, leaving a chilling silence in its wake. The encounter left us shaken, but it also strengthened us. We couldn't let fear paralyze us. We had to keep trying to signal for help, to find a way off the island. As dawn approached, the tension eased slightly. The night's terror seemed less immediate in the light of day, but we knew it was only a temporary reprieve. The spirit would return, of that we were certain. We used the daylight hours to fortify the lighthouse as best we could, and to gather more oil from the surrounding area to keep the beacon alight. We also explored the remaining parts of the lighthouse, hoping to find anything that could help us understand more about the spirit and the island. In a locked drawer in the keeper's quarters, we found a collection of old maps and notes. They were the writings of past lighthouse keepers, each detailing their experiences on the island. The notes spoke of the spirit, confirming Caleb's story of its vengeful nature. But one entry caught my eye. It mentioned a hidden cove on the north side of the island, where ships would sometimes anchor in secret. The discovery of the hidden cove in the lighthouse keeper's notes ignited a spark of hope in our weary hearts. We gathered around the old, weathered maps, tracing the path we would need to take. The cove was on the opposite side of the island, which meant a perilous journey through unknown terrain. But the chance of finding a way off the island was a risk we were willing to take. "We need to be smart about this," Caleb said, his finger following a winding path through the dense forest marked on the map. "The spirit seems most powerful at night. We should travel by day and find shelter before dusk." Ivy nodded in agreement, her eyes scanning the map. "We'll need food and water for the journey, and anything we can use as a weapon." We spent the day preparing. I scavenged the lighthouse and surrounding area for supplies while Caleb and Ivy went back to the village to gather anything useful they had left behind. By late afternoon we had amassed a modest supply of food, a couple of water flasks, the rusty knife, Caleb's crowbar, and a few makeshift weapons fashioned from debris. Our plan was to leave at dawn when the spirit's presence seemed weakest. We would follow the path marked on the map, moving as quickly and quietly as possible. The unknowns of the journey loomed large in our minds, but the prospect of escape pushed our fears to the back burner. That night we barely slept, our minds racing with what the next day would bring. The lighthouse was a silent keeper above us, its light a constant reflection of our fragile hope. As the first light of dawn crept over the horizon, we set out. The air was cool and misty, the island awakening with the sounds of nature. But beneath the serene facade, we knew the malevolent spirit was never far away. The path through the forest was overgrown and difficult to navigate. Every snap of a twig or rustle of leaves had us on edge, expecting the spirit to materialize at any moment. We spoke little, conserving our energy and staying alert to our surroundings. Midday found us at the edge of a steep ravine, the map indicating a narrow crossing further up. The going was slow, the ground treacherous. At one point Ivy slipped, nearly tumbling into the abyss, but Caleb caught her just in time. We pressed on. As the sun began to dip towards the horizon, we found a small, concealed clearing to camp for the night. We dared not light a fire, fearing it would attract the spirit. Instead, we huddled together for warmth, each lost in our thoughts. The night passed in a tense silence, every sound amplified in the darkness. But to our relief, the spirit did not make an appearance. As dawn broke, we continued our journey, the hidden cove now only a few hours away according to the map. But the island was not done with us yet. As we neared our destination, a dense fog rolled in, obscuring our vision and disorienting us. The once clear path became a maze of shadows and uncertainty. It was in this fog that the island revealed its final challenge, a group of hostile inhabitants. their eyes filled with the same madness we had seen in the village. The fog was thick, reducing our world to a few meters in front of us. We moved cautiously, aware of the danger presented by both the island's hostile inhabitants and the ever-present malevolent spirit. The muffled sounds of the forest seemed to come from all directions, disorienting us as we tried to navigate towards the cove. It was Caleb who first noticed the figures emerging from the mist, ragged, almost ghostly shapes, moving with a clear intent towards us. "We're not alone," he whispered urgently, gripping his crowbar tighter. We backed into a defensive circle, facing outwards. The figures circled us, their faces obscured by the fog and their own ragged hair. Their eyes, however, were unmistakably hostile, filled with a crazed fervor that spoke of long years on this forsaken island. One of them lunged suddenly, a crude spear aimed at Ivy. I acted on instinct, swinging my weapon and connecting with a thud. The figure fell back, a guttural cry escaping his lips, and the others hesitated. This hesitation gave us a precious moment. "Run!" I shouted, and we bolted, plunging deeper into the fog, the angry shouts of our pursuers ringing behind us. We ran until our lungs burned, the uneven ground and thick underbrush making our escape arduous. Finally, when we could no longer hear our pursuers, we slowed, trying to regain our bearings. The fog was beginning to lift, revealing glimpses of our surroundings. It was then that the betrayal happened. Caleb, who had been at my side, suddenly swung his crowbar at me with a wild look in his eyes. I barely managed to dodge the blow, stumbling back in shock. "Caleb, what are you doing?" I exclaimed. His face was twisted with desperation and madness. "I'm sorry," he gasped, "but I can't stay on this island any longer. I'll do whatever it takes to get off, even if it means leaving you behind." Ivy screamed, trying to intervene, but Caleb shoved her away. We grappled, the crowbar swinging wildly between us. In the struggle, Caleb lost his footing, tumbling down a steep embankment. I rushed to the edge, but it was too late. He lay motionless at the bottom, the crowbar beside him. The shock of what had just happened left Ivy and me stunned. We had lost not only a companion, but also our sense of trust and security. The realization that the island could drive someone to such extreme actions was terrifying. With heavy hearts, we continued towards the cove, the terrain becoming increasingly rocky and treacherous. The sound of waves crashing against the shore reached our ears, and soon we emerged from the forest onto a rocky beach. There, before us, lay the hidden cove, its waters dark and unwelcoming. But it was what we saw in the cove that brought us to a standstill. A small, dilapidated boat, half-sunken and clearly unusable. Our last hope of escape seemed to have vanished with the discovery of this wreck. The sight of the wrecked boat in the hidden cove was like a physical blow, draining the last vestiges of hope from us. Ivy and I stood in silence, the reality of our situation sinking in. The cove, which we had pinned all our hopes on, was nothing more than a dead end. A sense of despair threatened to overwhelm me, but I pushed it back. We couldn't afford to give in to hopelessness. "We need to keep moving," I said, trying to sound more confident than I felt. "There might be other boats or some other way off the island." Ivy nodded, her face pale but determined. We started to explore the cove, searching for anything that could be of use. The area was littered with debris from various shipwrecks. As we searched, the emotional toll of the past few days began to show. The betrayal and loss of Caleb weighed heavily on us. He had been driven to madness by the island, a fate that seemed to loom over us as well. We were alone again, just as we had been when we first washed up on this doomed shore. Our exploration of the cove revealed no other boats, but we did find some useful supplies among the wreckage. A few tins of food, a length of sturdy rope, and a flare gun with a single flare. It wasn't much, but it was something. The sun was beginning to set, painting the sky in hues of orange and red. We knew we couldn't stay in the open. The spirit was most active at night. Finding a somewhat sheltered area beneath an overhanging rock, we prepared to spend another night on the island. The night was restless, filled with the sounds of the island. The distant howls and whispers seemed closer here, as if the spirit was aware of our presence in its domain. We took turns keeping watch, the flare gun close at hand. It was during my watch that I saw it, a faint light on the horizon, moving slowly, a ship. I nudged Ivy awake, pointing towards the light. Our hearts soared with hope. This could be our chance. We waited anxiously as the ship drew closer, the outline becoming more distinct. It was a small vessel, possibly a fishing boat. As it neared the cove, we realized this was our moment. I grabbed the flare gun, aiming it into the sky. With a deep breath, I pulled the trigger. The flare shot up, illuminating the night with a bright red light. We watched, holding our breath, as the boat slowed, its searchlight sweeping the cove. For what felt like an eternity, the boat hovered at the mouth of the cove. Then, to our immense relief, it began to move towards us. Salvation had finally come. We had survived the island, the spirit, and the betrayal. But as the boat drew closer, a chilling realization dawned on us. The vessel was in poor condition, its hull marked with strange symbols, and the crew, they were not rescuers, but more of the island's crazed inhabitants, their eyes gleaming with the same madness we had seen in the village. The island had one more cruel trick to play. Our rescue was not a rescue at all, but a descent into deeper horror. Our would-be rescuers were in fact more of the island's deranged inhabitants. Panic surged through me, but I knew we couldn't afford to lose our heads. "Ivy, we need to hide!" I whispered urgently, pulling her away from the shoreline and into the shadows beneath the overhanging rock. We watched in trepidation as the boat anchored near the shore. The crew disembarked, their movements erratic and unpredictable. They began to search the cove, their strange, garbled language filling the air. It was clear they were looking for something, or someone. Huddled in our hiding spot, Ivy and I discussed our options. Our situation was dire. Confrontation was inevitable, but perhaps we could use the element of surprise to our advantage. As we plotted, my eyes fell on the flare gun, now spent and useless. But the flare gun reminded me of the lighthouse keeper's notes. The island's history might hold a clue, a weakness of the spirit that we could exploit. "I have an idea," I said, recalling a particular note from the lighthouse keeper. "The spirit. It's bound to the island because of its betrayal and murder. What if we could find where it happened? Maybe there's a way to appease it, or at least distract it." Ivy looked skeptical but nodded. "It's better than nothing, but first we need to deal with them," she said, nodding towards the searching crew. We waited until a couple of the crew members wandered closer to our hiding place. In a swift, coordinated move, we ambushed them. The element of surprise worked in our favor, and we managed to overpower them, albeit with a struggle. We quickly scavenged what we could from them, a knife and a map of the island with strange symbols scrawled over it. Studying the map, I noticed that one of the symbols matched the statue in the village square. "This could be it," I said, pointing to the symbol. "It's near the village. That might be where the spirit was betrayed." We knew we had to move quickly. The rest of the crew would soon notice the absence of their companions. Making our way back through the forest, we avoided the main paths, using the map as our guide. We found the statue in the village square, the faceless figure now seeming more ominous than ever. The ground around the statue was disturbed, as if it had been recently dug up and then hastily covered again. Working together, we began to dig with our bare hands and the knife we had acquired. It wasn't long before our fingers hit something solid. A chest, old and partially rotted, but still intact. We pried it open, revealing its contents: a collection of personal belongings and a small, intricately carved box. Inside the box was a locket containing a faded portrait of a woman and a lock of hair. The air around us grew colder, and a sense of sadness, profound and ancient, enveloped us. The whispers in the wind grew louder, more coherent, speaking of betrayal and loss. "We need to return these to the sea," I said, a plan forming in my mind. "It's what the spirit wants, to return what was taken from it." With the locket and the lock of hair in our possession, we made our way to the shore, the whispers growing more urgent, urging us on. Every rustle in the bushes, every snap of a twig underfoot heightened our anxiety. The island, with its watchful eyes and whispering winds, seemed to be closing in on us, aware of our intentions to appease the spirit. As we approached the shoreline, the atmosphere grew increasingly oppressive. The air was thick with a sense of impending doom, as if the island itself was bracing for a climactic confrontation. We had barely reached the water's edge when we heard them, the crazed inhabitants of the island, their shouts carrying through the trees. They had discovered our escape from the cove and were now in hot pursuit. Ivy and I exchanged a determined glance. We couldn't let them stop us. The first of the inhabitants burst through the tree line, wild-eyed and menacing. Without hesitation, Ivy and I sprang into action. We fought with a desperate ferocity, driven by our need to end this nightmare. The conflict was chaotic and brutal. At one point, I found myself wrestling for control of a knife, narrowly avoiding slashes that would have been fatal. Despite our efforts, more inhabitants appeared, seemingly endless in number. We were being pushed back inch by inch towards the sea. I caught Ivy's eye, and without needing to speak, we understood each other. This was our last stand. But then, amidst the chaos, a surreal calm descended upon the scene. The sea began to churn, and a dense mist rolled in, enveloping us all. The inhabitants halted in their tracks, their madness temporarily subdued by the overwhelming presence that now permeated the air. From the mist emerged the spirit, its form more defined than ever, a manifestation of sorrow and rage. It moved towards us, its gaze fixed on the locket and hair in my hand. The inhabitants fell to their knees, as if in reverence or fear. With my heart pounding in my chest, I stepped forward, holding out the locket and hair. "We return what was taken from you," I called out to the spirit. "Find peace and release this island from your curse." The spirit hovered before me, its form trembling like a flame in the wind. Slowly it reached out, taking the locket and hair into its ethereal hands. A wave of emotion washed over us. Grief, regret, and finally, a sense of release. The spirit turned, drifting towards the sea. As it reached the water's edge, it turned one last time, a silent acknowledgement before dissipating into the mist. As the spirit vanished, the island seemed to exhale a long-held breath. The mist receded, and the inhabitants, now released from their madness, looked around in confusion, as if waking from a long, terrible dream. The lifting of the curse was like the breaking of a dam, releasing a flood of relief and disbelief. The inhabitants, now freed from the spirit's grasp, were disoriented, their expressions showing confusion and dawning awareness. Ivy and I approached them cautiously, unsure of their reaction. To our surprise, they welcomed us. Their leader, an older man with weathered features, introduced himself as Nolan. He spoke of how the spirit's influence had clouded their minds, trapping them in a state of fear and aggression. Now, with the spirit appeased, they were themselves again, though the memory of their actions under the curse weighed heavily on them. Nolan explained that they were the descendants of the original settlers of the island, living in isolation and, until recently, in harmony with their surroundings. He offered us their hospitality and assistance, grateful for the liberation we had inadvertently brought them. We spent the next few days recuperating in their village, a quaint settlement hidden within the forest. The villagers shared their food and resources with us, and in turn, we helped them repair some of the damage done during their time under the curse. During our stay, we learned that a radio was present in the village, once used to communicate with the mainland for supplies. However, it had been long since functional. With some tinkering and repairs, using skills I barely remembered from my own past, I managed to restore it to working condition. We sent out a distress signal, detailing our location and the dire circumstances of our arrival on the island. We then settled into an anxious wait, not knowing if our message had been received or if anyone would come for us. In the meantime, we continued to help the villagers, aiding them in re-establishing their lives. It was a period of healing for everyone, a time to reconcile with the past and look towards the future. Then, one afternoon, a reply crackled through the radio. A rescue team had received our signal and was on their way. The news spread through the village, igniting joy. The villagers, while happy for us, faced a difficult decision about their own future. Some expressed the desire to leave the island and reintegrate into society, while others wanted to remain, continuing their isolated way of life now that the curse was lifted. As for Ivy and me, the thought of returning to civilization brought a sense of surreal relief. We had survived the unimaginable, a tale that seemed too extraordinary to be believed. Yet the scars we bore, both physical and emotional, were proof of the reality we had lived through. The days leading up to the arrival of the rescue team were a flurry of activity. The villagers, divided in their decision to stay or leave, worked together to prepare for the arrival of outsiders. For some, it was a chance for a new beginning. For others, it was a farewell to the only life they had known. Ivy and I helped where we could, but often we found ourselves pulled into moments of reflection. We talked about our experiences on the island, the fear and despair, the moments of hope, and the strange bond we had formed with it and its inhabitants. The island had changed us in ways we were still trying to understand. The day of the rescue team's arrival dawned clear and bright. When the sound of helicopter blades cutting through the sky finally reached us, it felt surreal. The villagers gathered, their faces a mosaic of emotions: hope, sadness, curiosity. As the rescue team landed, we were greeted with professionalism and amazement. They couldn't believe we had survived so long on the island, let alone lifted an ancient curse. We shared our story, which was met with incredulous looks and notes taken for future investigation. The team was efficient, providing medical checkups and preparing us for the journey back to civilization. Some villagers chose to leave with us, seeking to reconnect with the world outside. Nolan, with tears in his eyes, chose to stay, along with a few others who couldn't bear to leave their ancestral home. The helicopter ride away from the island was a moment of mixed emotions. Relief and excitement were touched by a sense of loss. The island, for all its horrors, had also been a place of profound discovery and growth. As we flew away, I watched the island shrink away, becoming just a speck in the vast ocean. Ivy and I sat in silence, each lost in our thoughts. We were survivors, heading back to a world that had continued without us, a world that would struggle to comprehend our ordeal. Returning to civilization was a disorienting experience. The world had moved on in our absence, and we struggled to find our place in it. Ivy and I stayed in contact, finding solace in our shared experience, the only ones who truly understood what we had been through. In the weeks following our rescue, we underwent numerous debriefings and medical evaluations. Psychologists were particularly interested in our mental resilience and how we coped with the extreme stress and isolation. There was talk of a book, even a documentary, but we were hesitant. Reliving the experience for the public felt like a violation of the raw, personal ordeal we had endured. It was during one of these interviews that the twist came. A researcher specializing in island mythology and history presented us with a shocking revelation. The island, it turned out, was not unknown to the world. It had a name, a history, but most chillingly, it had a reputation. Your story aligns with several lost myths about the island, the researcher explained. It was known as Isola di Sospiri, the island of sighs. For centuries it was feared by sailors and believed to be damned. But what's fascinating is that no one has been able to locate it for over 100 years. It was considered a legend, a ghost island. Ivy and I exchanged a stunned look. Our island, our nightmare, was a place that shouldn't exist in the modern world. Yet we had lived it, survived it. The researcher continued, "There's more. According to legend, the curse could only be lifted by returning what was taken, as you did. But the myth concludes with a warning. The spirit is not destroyed, only appeased. It's said that the island disappears, only to reappear when the spirit grows restless again." This revelation sent a chill down my spine. The island was a shifting, living entity, bound to the spirit's unrest. As we processed this information, a deeper understanding settled between Ivy and me. Our escape from the island was a chapter in a much larger, ongoing story, one that transcended time and logic. In the following days, Ivy and I made a decision. We would not publicize our story. The world was not ready for such a tale, and we were not prepared to relive it for the sake of curiosity. Instead, we chose to move forward, carrying the lessons and strength we had gained from the island. Our bond remained strong, a unique connection forged in the most unlikely of circumstances. And while the rest of the world remained oblivious, we knew the truth. The island of sighs was out there, waiting, its story not yet finished.